3, 2, 1.
Hello my Blender friends, this one is for those new to UV mapping in Blender, or just new to Blender. It's a pretty quick run through of what you may encounter on your Blender adventures, so let's get getting on here. Well, here we are in Blender, and it's an exciting place to be, not just because we're going to be UV mapping today in Blender, but because today was the official release date of Blender 2.91. Yes, it was such a popular download earlier today, it was crapping out their servers, so I waited till this evening, and here it is. You may be watching this years in the future thinking, I hope this guy shuts up sometime soon. So here we go. We're going to start with the default cube. Yes, we're going to keep the default cube, and I'm going to show you why. I'm going to have it selected and go into the UV editing tab here at the top. Now this is a beginner tutorial, so I might mention some of my shortcuts. You'll see right off the bat we've got what looks like some pretty decent UV coordinates here on the left hand side. This is a perfect cube and we've got perfect squares on the left, which makes total sense. So why in the world are we learning how to make UVs or UV map if Blender's already giving us what looks like good UV coordinates? Well, that only applies to primitives in Blender. Whenever you create a primitive in Blender, it gives you its corresponding UVs for free. Unfortunately, most of the time you'll be working with models that you've created from scratch or that you've derived from these primitives, so that kind of negates any coordinates Blender gives you. Now I'm going to tab out of edit mode. I could just go up here to do the same thing, so I hit tab to get out of edit mode. Now I'm going to transform this on one axis by going into the scale tool here and just dragging this up, elongating this like so, and then I'm going to tab back into edit mode. You'll see that the UV coordinates no longer correspond to the shape of the model. We don't have any elongated sides here in our UV coordinates. Now, how do we fix this? Well, we could go to this set of UV operators. I'm going to use Smart UV. All of these are relevant, but I'm just going to use Smart UV as an example here. Go OK. Well, that didn't work. It's actually just made things worse the way it sort of rearranged our faces here. And we don't have our elongated sides yet. So what did we do wrong? Well, when we were in object mode, we should have actually applied the transform that we did first. So let's tab back into object mode, and I'm going to hit Control A, which brings up our transform menu. We scaled, so we can go down to scale here, that would make sense, or we could go all transforms or rotate and scale, because scale's in there too. I'm just going to go to scale, and now I'm going to tab back into edit mode, and you'll see we still haven't had anything improve here on the left hand side. But now what if we applied one of these operators? We'll go to Smart UV again, and there you go. Now we've got our elongated faces. Now this would be just fine if we were using an application like Substance Painter that's actually painting on the 3D model. But if we were to take this and manually paint it, when I say manually paint it, I mean create a UV template from this and bring it into Photoshop, then we're going to run into problems, and I'll show you why. I'm going to hit 3 to go into faces here. And actually, if you want things to display on the left full time, you're going to have to press the sync button at the top left. The two little arrows. Unfortunately, like if you look at these two in the middle, you see on the actual model that there's this massive gap between these two faces. So if you were to paint a stroke across these two faces in Photoshop, you'd have this huge gap between the two. That's not going to work. You hit the G, you can access the move tool and move these around wherever you want. You can just arrange these coordinates now using the move and rotate tools if you want to make this totally paintable in Photoshop, but there's an easier way. Let's go to our edges, and I'm going to define some seams. Just say this was a cardboard box and I were to unfold it. Now the thing about creating seams is you want them in the least visible place as possible. That means that you'd utilize these short sides because they would make for shorter seams, and I'm going to select those first. Let's grab that one too. And then I'm going to right click, mark seam, and then I'm going to hit A to select all. I'm going to UV, unwrap, and now we've got a much more paintable model to work with. You can see in red the where our seams are. And now in Photoshop we wouldn't have any problem whatsoever painting across these. And now, so to create a template in Photoshop, you just have to select all your faces here, go to UV and go to Export UV Layout, and then decide where you want to save that image. And here you can define the size, the image type. I usually use a PNG and leave it at the default fill opacity. So I think it's safe to say somewhere along the line you're going to run into something more complicated than a box that you have to unwrap. So we've got this head here. I know it seems like we're going 0 to 60 in like hypercar speed, but not to worry, we can apply some of the same principles that we just learned on this head using seams. So I'm just going to select this, tab into edit mode, take a look at our geometry. It doesn't look too crazy. Okay, I'm just going to go to object mode, select the head, hit the period on the number pad to frame selected, and go back into edit mode. Then I'm going to hit number 2 to go into edges again. And the first edge I'm going to select, actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to select the whole thing just to check out what we've got for UVs now. Hit the A key. Holy smokes, what a bird's nest. So we can definitely do something about that. I'm going to hit the sync button at the top left again to make sure that our UVs stay in view. I go back to our model here, and I'm going to start with the seam in the middle. Now be careful not to come down too far with this seam, because it will potentially affect our final result, because again, we don't want any visible seams. So I've got that one selected there. Now I'm going to go to the back here, and I'm going to hold the Shift and Control, and then that gives us everything in between. Then I'm going to hold Shift and Alt to get this bottom edge loop here. And then I'm going to right click and go to Mark Seam. Here's an important step. I have to select all again, so hit A, and then apply our operator to unwrap. There you go, much better. So I'm just going to rotate this to make things a little bit nicer. Now you'll notice that UV maps are always within a square like this, and it does matter how much area a given part of your UV coordinates take in this square. Basically, the more area they take up within the square, the more resolution that they get. So you're going to have to be sort of cognizant of that when you're laying out your UVs, and you're going to want to lay out your UVs as efficiently as possible as well. Now this looks pretty cool, and it looks like it'd be easy enough to paint in, say, Photoshop if we did a UV template from this. But there will be some problems just because of all this detail we have, all these raised areas. So for those of you unfamiliar with how this works, normals are what determines the way each of these faces are displayed, and they're at right angles with these faces. What Blender is trying to do is it's trying to average out the angle of these normals to give as accurate a map as possible when it unwraps these things. Now if you're giving Blender all of these normals to deal with, the algorithm is trying to average out over a lot of different angles, which makes it very difficult for it to do an accurate job. I'll show you now what I mean. So I'm going to actually go into the shading tab here. Okay, here in the shading tab, I'm going to want to frame my model here. So I'm going to hit the period on the numpad. And then I'm going to go down here to the node editor window and hit Shift A and add an image texture. I've got a pre-prepared checkerboard here that I use to check stretching. Now you can use a grid, checkerboard, whatever you want. You'll see what I mean here. Open, and I'm going to connect that to the base color. And there you go. Gives us an idea of how stretched things are. You can see we've got some pretty decent uniformity here around the neck and the back of the head, and the rest of this is a bit of a mess. I'm gonna jump back into the UV editing. I'm gonna click on the sync button here at the top left. Now if we give Blender's algorithm fewer normals to deal with, it's gonna have a lot easier time flattening things out. So that would entail chopping this model up a bit, and we want to minimize seams if we're doing this in Photoshop. So one way we could handle this is we could use some of these tools on the left hand side. We've got relax and pinch. These essentially work like brushes. I can use the square bracket here to make this a little bit larger. I'm going to bring the strength down to 1 is like really heavy handed. We're going to want to come down to like 15 or something like that. Now I'm going to start with the relax around the eye here, and I'll show you what this does. So I'm just going to work this corner. See how it sort of unstretches? You're only going to be able to get this to look so good. So let's undo all this and try a different approach. I'm going to do what I said earlier here and give Blender a little bit less to deal with by selecting some of these edge loops here. I'm going to grab the lip and I'm going to give that a seam, mark seam, and I'm going to separate out the neck as well. And just where I created the seam for the neck, I'm going to isolate these faces, and I'm going to separately apply the unwrap to those. So these really look like they did before because Blender wasn't having a hard time dealing with them in the first place. Now, but because we separated them from the rest of the model, this area that Blender was having a hard time with, when we recalculate that, I'll hit unwrap. You'll see we're getting a far nicer result now. I'm just going to grab the lips and separately do the operation on those as well, the unwrap. Jumping ahead here, I've remapped the lips, so there's actually a seam between the top and bottom lip. As you can see here, they're both separated. Seem to work out better that way. And I've just created seams around the ears. The nose, I used a little bit of the relax around the nose and the eyes and the corners of the mouth. And now I'm just ready to separate out the ears. Now I'm going to hit the 3 for my face select the some faces on the ears, and then hit Control L, and that selects everything within the bounds of the seams. And I'll go to the unwrap. There we go. I've also remapped the neck so it comes up closer to the jawline, and did some scaling. I could go a lot further refining this, of course, to get rid of all this stretching here, but anyway, that's just to give you a very basic idea of how to go about doing this. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this very basic introduction to UV unwrapping in Blender. Ciao for now!